Let's call to order the March meeting of the Historic Square Preservation Commission. And first of all, could we look at the agenda? We have administrative approvals, one COA, and a staff update. Do I hear a motion to approve?
Motion.
Motion from Griffin and a second from Amanda. All in favor, say aye. Aye. And could we please look at the February minutes, which have been emailed to you? Does anybody want to make any changes to those, or do we hear a motion to approve as drawn?
Move we approve.
Second.
Motion from Andy, a second from Stuart, and all in favor,
Aye.
say aye.
Aye.
And we have approved the minutes. There are a couple of administrative approvals that you can read about in your email that do not require us to go over. One for a plaque, an awesome Ronzo plaque that is at the Powerhouse, and one for vinyl signage. And our first COA is number 369, Kaleidoscope. Kate, will you talk about that, and are you leaving?
I need to recuse myself, Madam Chairman.
Okay. Andy will step out for this one.
Okay, so as I'm sure you guys saw in the staff report, originally the applicant was proposing signage for this building. The Kaleidoscope is moving into the building that was Bells and Bows. And I believe Angel can answer this question, but I believe also the second space next door. But they have actually withdrawn that sign application, and they're gonna do window and door decals. And we sort of worked that all out last week, so they don't have those ready yet, but we're gonna do those in a staff approval level. So basically today we're just talking about removing the awnings, the Bells and Bows awning and that black awning next door. Although they're not quite ready to remove the black awning because they're using that building for storage right now, so it would sort of become very obvious that they're storing things in there, so they're gonna wait until they're all moved in to remove the black awning, but the pink awning would come off immediately, and any necessary repairs, they might need to, we don't know what it looks like under there, so whether there needs to be repointing or any painting to match the existing facade, they might need to do that type of work, but staff does not have a problem with anything proposed, and we're recommending approval. So.
Okay, thank you, Kate. So to remove the awning, and then you will take care of overseeing the vinyl decal signs.
It'll be very similar to the fresh ink case that was an administrative approval and included with this week's packet. There's the land development code specifies the percentage of the window that can be covered, and that the lettering should be done professionally. So, and I don't anticipate any problems with that. Yeah.
Well, I move we approve COA 369.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Welcome back.
Welcome back to the square. Thank you. Okay. Oh, thank you. Kate's gonna get Andy back.
It's nice to see everybody.
Nice to see you, Ben.
Swift justice?
Swift justice. It's a hard no.
Ben, you're going to tell us about a new ordinance proposal, please?
You bet, absolutely. I'll refresh y'all's memory. We discussed in situations of demolition on the square, whether it's by an application for a COA or it's for emergency as deemed by the building official purposes. I think a potential flaw that exists where a building could be demolished and it could sit in a state of disarray for a period of time. And so the question was asked of staff of how we could address that, how we could at least provide some sort of a protection that would at least remedy the site, which could be remedy from stabilization standpoint, which would be removing any materials, potential for walls. It would also require also the stabilization. So there's the potential that you could be required to bring in fill and then also maybe sod or landscape a site. So that was the ask of us. I hope I characterized that right from our previous discussions. We've been working on this over the last month or so, and so before you is a draft of what we believe would address that concern. So this would be an amendment to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. It would go into section 5428, which actually flows pretty nicely because you have the provisions of demolition in 5427, I believe, maybe 26 and 27, or is it just 27? Just 27, and so then this would be the subsequent sections 28, which states, and if I remember right, Commissioner Paval, he indicated that this would be kind of like, or I think maybe I said it would be kind of like a restoration bond, but then I think he added that it would also need to be maybe stabilization and restoration bond or plan. So in order to accomplish that, we would need two things. And so A would say, included with a request for demolition, that would be a certificate of appropriateness request, or when somebody was evoking the safety exclusion, public safety exclusion, then they would have to provide us with a plan to stabilize that site, to restore it, to provide a landscaping plan, a grading plan. So there's a potential that we could require several different things depending on the circumstances that come forward. That the developer would then have to also provide us with two quotes. That's not typical. It's not typical because in most instances with our bonds, we would have, all of our performance requirements and we know exactly what it's going to be. But for the scope of the services in this work, we feel that that they should provide us with two separate quotes. That way we make sure that we have at least a decent amount. We don't know if we would take the higher amount or if we would take the lower amount. If we would take an average, I think that that's going to be at our discretion to ultimately determine what would be the appropriate amount. So that's part A. That's a lot to take in, and so I'll entertain any questions that you might have on part A.
Who is most likely to invoke the public safety exclusion? The city?
Yes.
City prepared to sign up for this too?
Well, I think it would be in concert with the owner of a building. So I don't think that we're going to, they're appealing to us and they're saying, hey, this is a public safety hazard. And so we're going to say, okay, sure, just no different than how, what previously happened. We would have the building official have to go and evaluate and whatever requirements would be needed to determine whether or not that building is safe or it's a threat to public safety. Then it would be his recommendation to say that the building needs to be demolished. And what we're saying is the developer or the owner of that building would then be required to provide us with all of these elements for that request.
So if the city on its own initiative invoked the public safety, are you saying that would you then force?
But wouldn't we do demolition by neglect rather than?
Potentially.
Is this public safety exclusion? I guess it would depend on the hazard to public.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be an instance where the public safety provision could be, and that's why we're here. We thought through this in so many different ways. We need another perspective, so that's why
it just jumped out to me that you're signing up for that. Not only is the city signing up for it, but to the extent that you invoke it, you are effectively telling a landowner that they've got to do these things because it's your subjective thought that there's a public safety. Just a thought.
Okay?
Let's see, I had a couple thoughts on it. I mean, I think it looks overall good. The one question I had is it says, should the city declare the site abandoned, or should the certificate of appropriateness expire? Does that assume that we as a commission can decline to renew a COA and therefore trigger the site restoration bond?
Yes. I think there's a process for renewals, and so long as an applicant complies with that process for renewal, that could come back before this commission, and I think you have a right to approve or deny that request for a renewal of a COA. If it's denied, then that COA is no longer valid, and so then we could require the bond to be called.
I would imagine that, and this would be education for me that I'd be looking for, I'd imagine that a commission deciding to deny a COA application when nothing has changed except a year has passed could be seen as a somewhat arbitrary decision to do that, right? To say, well, a year has passed, nothing else has changed, so we're just gonna deny you, and now you've got to pay. Could that get I'm sort of, playing the game of chess here, one step move, could that get the city then in trouble for arbitrary decisions made by the commission?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a question for the city's legal department, but I think the city has a right to enforce its rules, and if the design guidelines and all of those elements, and so I don't know of any specific instances where and Andy, you might be able to help me, but I can't think of any specific instances where a request for a COA has been denied that was previously granted. I can't think of like an extension of a COA, which is effectively a new COA, but I can't recall of a circumstance. It's not to say that wouldn't
I saw
itself,
one get some votes against it, which was the Stefanos Hotel, and it did get renewed, but it got at least one, maybe two votes against it, and I could see a potential where a commission loses patience after a number of years and denies it, and now all of a sudden the developer's on the hook for the site, which I think is okay. I mean, at a certain number of years, you got to say, all right, listen, fish or cut bait, you got to fix the site now. Maybe it happens after 1 year, but.
Sure, because something could change, and something did change in the Stefanos project, and that was that we built a parking garage there, and that did change the area some. So something like that could happen.
Yeah, that happened also. We adopted a new land development code. We had new rules and regulations, so I think what was previously approved would not fully would not fully comply with the requirements of the current land development code, and so that's something that's factored in. It's also, I can tell you in my tenure with the city, there's only been a few times where, on the planning side, we have a site restoration bond, which accounts for basically, the repairing of a site back to flat land and sod. That's effectively what it requires. And in my tenure with the city, there's been 3 instances that I can recall that we got to a point where we were calling, where we were going to call a bond, and then the developer actually repaired the site on his own accord, so that way he didn't have, the bond wasn't called. And so, work with us. Ultimately, I think that's where we would rather be than to call a particular bond. I think the bond gives us some assurance. That's not to say that as part of consideration for a renewal of a COA that this commission, perhaps could use some of your discretion to be able to require some things be done to a site.
Yeah, so that was my follow-up question is if this commission says, listen, it's been a year, you've got to do some restoration here, and in this conversation you can offer some things to do it on your own, or we can deny the COA. Would that be deny the COA and trigger this restoration bond? I mean, or are we getting into legal? I'm just trying to figure out, you know,
Yeah, it's a good question
this has
for
teeth.
legal also,
Right,
and to see what would be required of it. But I think there's potential there. But I can certainly follow up with Pope and Paul and see what they have to say.
What about, you know, I guess I'm thinking more like, for example, like the Round Table building, or like where they're redoing the S&J art galleries, you know, and it gets to a point like 208 where maybe financially the building owner, you know, says this is way more than I asked for, and we have this restoration plan in place, but I mean, ultimately our goal, especially a building in between buildings, wouldn't be to have a landscape plan, you know, in between historic square. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. I also don't think that the goal is to have an open pit either that could potentially create erosion issues for an adjacent building, you know, so I think what the intent of this would be to at least, you know, from a temporary standpoint, get that site to where it's stable and, you know, not potentially causing those threats to adjacent buildings and foundations, but also to at least, I think we could all agree that a site that's under construction, you know, cannot be all that presentable to the aesthetics of the environment. And so if we can at least get it to a point where it's grassed, I think that's better, right? That's a better solution for a temporary period. And it's easier for a developer or future developments to come in and work on a site that already has, now they may, you know, it may not be at compaction levels to be able to have a building, but at least it's just flat ground that they could use as a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more from the adjacent building owners' worry of the structural foundations of the square, and just having the rains we've had and the snow, and you start getting these foundational issues. I mean, it's very specific, but I guess what just happened obviously did just happen, and I'd be real worried if I was Square Books or Regions taking on all this water and a pit.
And so I think that this is what would try, you know, be in place to at least address that.
Ben, since 208 is sort of what got us here, just sort of thinking about things that could happen, would you walk us through how this, if we had already had this in place a year ago, how would things have been different, or would they be yet? Would it take a year first? Tell us what would happen if this were approved. What probably would have happened.
Well, so can we talk about B and then let me address that, because B would be an important part to this.
Yes, please.
So before any permits could be issued, which would include the demolition permit, anything, we would have to have on file this bond, right? And it would be a performance bond made out to the city, no different than our site restoration bond, which we already have in place. And so it would be, you know, a surety company. And we're only going to accept a bond in this instance. There are instances where we take a cashier's check or a bank letter of credit. In this instance, we would only take a bond. And why that's important to us is if we're at a point where we have to call a bond, we contact the surety company, and they're the ones that actually, they have the approvals to be able to go onto their client's property, the developer's property, and they would be the ones that would install all of these improvements. It wouldn't be the city of Oxford. We would work directly with the surety company. They would have to install that stuff. So that's the process that we would follow. In the instance of 208, I suppose let's say we're right here, we don't have anything else that's approved, but yet we have this bond. What we would do is we would contact the developer, put them on notice that you know, within a certain period of time, if they don't move forward with plans and approval, then we're going to call the bond. That's a pretty serious, I think, Stuart could speak to this, I think Griffin could speak to this. That's a pretty serious reality for developers to face, because there are negatives that go along with that, with future bond ratings, and I mean, there's penalty provisions that go along with that. So that definitely grabs their attention when we try it, because at the end of the day, what we want to see is something built, right? That's ultimately our goal. It's not to penalize people. So we would at least work with them to come up with a plan, and then they would come before the commission, I suppose, to get their, to request their approval, because at this point, they have not had any building plans that have been approved, right? That's why this one's a little peculiar in this whole process, but, so we would try and get that plan. If they don't meet the timelines or the established milestones that we would have a part of that plan, then we would start moving forward with calling the bond. We would contact the surety company, let them know, and then at that point, they're gonna go to and put in place the plan that we have approved as part of that bond.
And if I can jump in, like on that plan, if I were the commissioner, when we were presented this restoration plan, I would have included facing the backside of square books with brick. I would have included certainly landscaping. It would have been, for me, I would have said, we need more than grass. We need you to finish what is now an open wound on the backside of these buildings. Stormwater would have been a concern. I want to see grading. I want to see how you're capturing it, where it's going. Just to jump in, like that's some of the things that I would have on this one been saying needs to be a part of that restoration.
So they
But
can all be different.
how does the building come back in place? I mean, after they've done the landscaping, after they have done what the bond was called, the landscaping is done, how do we get a building back in that spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately depends on the.
Well, I mean, you've already come
developer.
to the end of the road after the landscaping and the bond is called, correct?
Well, I think it just brings that site into a state where it's not having an adverse effect on adjacent buildings, right? And
I know, but do we what are we gonna do if we've got a hole in Oxford? How do we get it filled? There's no recourse at all to get a building back in place, is there?
So Lee, are you suggesting after we've called this bond and they've made the repairs based on the restoration plan that is in place?
I'm just saying that what if the person who owns this property decides that they're just gonna leave the landscaping? I mean, that could be possible, could it not?
Absolutely.
And what are we gonna do? We're just gonna have like a hole here and a hole here and a hole here?
I couldn't agree more with you, and I think that's, part of the concern is you could be provided with plans for demolition of a building and you approve a design that goes back, and there's no guarantee that building is going to be constructed.
I know, but that's something doesn't sound like I want it to happen.
We have.
But I don't know, landscaping in a hole, some of these buildings are very narrow.
Yeah.
And I understand you are worried about the neighbors and the sides, but it's just gonna be a hole in the square. Just like it is now, we're at 208. I don't know how you can totally beautify that place.
I understand. I think we were tasked with making sure that there isn't a hole, like a physical hole. I think that's what the commission asked for us to look to address. I agree with you that I have concerns about how you get a building to go back there. I think that's, there's a lot of onus on the property owner and the development community to be able to do that. But we have seen in the Historic Preservation Commission, the other district, where a request for demolition was received and it was approved with building plans for something to go back. The building was demolished and nothing was ever constructed. There's no guarantee that there is going to be a building produced, and that's always a risk associated with demolitions, which is why I also think that you treat them, very carefully. You already do, and they're seldom granted.
I understand, but our buildings are very old on the square, so we just don't know. The other thought that came to mind while I'm talking is, suppose this property is sold. In the middle of these 3 years, will this transfer to the new owners?
It's a
or
good
does
question.
that disappear? Sometimes
Yeah.
does legally, I don't know, maybe Andy can answer.
Well, it's a good question. We see that with,
I don't think you can mandate that to run with the land.
what we would do though is we would require the new owner to provide us with a bond before we're gonna release the other bond. So the city would have to release the bond to the, and the surety company requires the city to provide a notice of release.
If they sell.
In any instance. So even our bonds that we have right now, we have to provide the surety company with a notice of release, even when the project's completed, or it never moves forward. And so in this instance, when there's a transaction between two parties, then we would not release the original bond, which, I mean, it can be expensive. So we would not release that until we had a replacement bond from the new owners.
And the new owners would have to be aware of the bond.
Correct.
Is that, I think that's a great question, is that sort of standard procedure in the legal world that you can require a new bond? I mean, or does that need, I'm asking, does that need to be in the ordinance, or is that sort of like, that's background legal stuff that would always happen anyway?
Typically the surety company requires the release requirements. I think what you're asking is, do we need to actually explicitly state in here that should this be, sold? It's a good question. I don't, I'm not opposed to putting it in the ordinance.
But only if it needs to be, I mean.
Yeah, only if it needs to be. That's right. And I mean, that's our policy. I don't know that it's not stated here, but I mean, we can certainly put it in if necessary.
Help me remember, when we talked about, probably 4 or 5 years ago, we talked about demolition. And at that time, I thought my understanding was that the requirement was whether the city or a landowner asked to be, to demolish something, that the minimum requirement was a landscaping plan, right? And is that how the statute still reads today?
In commercial districts, you need to have either a landscaping plan or plans for new construction. In residential districts, you must have plans for new construction.
Okay.
There's not a landscaping option.
Okay.
And we've never really dealt with the public safety requirement for the purposes of demolition. And I think in this instance, this is the first time that I've dealt with it, and I think and you've been out here for quite some time. I don't know that you've ever seen anything that's come before the commission, but you have a building official and an applicant saying this building's unsafe, it needs to come down right now. And do you leave it stand while they develop plans and get it approved to go through that process? That's the challenge that we faced in this instance. And I think that at a minimum, this would have to be required going forward in the future, which would include the landscaping provision.
It just seems like the city would want to have not necessarily a separate standard, but it would want to have certain public policy rights preserved, not on the initiative of the landowner, but by open and notorious danger to the public, that should have some police powers that will require you not necessarily the taking of land, but something less than this. I'm not advocating that you not be held to the same standard, but I'm not sure they're apples and oranges. I mean, certainly I think they're probably different. Your powers versus someone on their own volition seeking to remove a piece of property that they own. Maybe Paul and Pope could shed some light on the expanse of your police powers in the city. But in an exigent situation like that, I'm sure the city wants to be held to this standard. Maybe it does. It's just a thought. That some situations where it's got to come down, like the Thompson House, it had to come down or it's going to come down on somebody. Did you really have time to move on that? I mean, to secure a bond, and do these up and obtain a plan? I don't think you did.
I don't disagree, but I think that's what staff was asked to look at, is how you prevent the current state of affairs from happening again. And I think that this is our best option that we can come to, is to treat it like a bond at this point, or to require a plan and a bond to go with it. I agree, it's very time sensitive, but you know, I think I think at the end of the day, it's as good as we can get.
There are a lot of legal issues in this. Taking a property, subjective decision on behalf of the city, owner's requirements on a property owner, the lease protects legitimate city interest. All those issues just jump out, but that's the reason I think Pope and Paul make a good.
Yeah, and Pope and Paul have weighed in on this, and this is very comparable to other bonds that we require and that are you know, absolutely legal. So they felt comfortable with this language that we have right now.
Okay. They certainly are the experts in this work. Maybe it's a poor understanding that I have about when does the city require a performance bond?
Well, I'll speak in site restoration bonds because that's what I deal with on a regular basis. So before the issuance of a land disturbance permit for developments of a certain threshold, so as typically a dollar amount associated with that, a site restoration bond is required before that land disturbance permit can be provided.
Okay, so is that on any dwelling or any commercial property, or?
It's typically the threshold is not a single family house. The threshold is typically larger developments which may have multiple single family homes in it, so subdivision that's created, or a larger commercial development. For example, like the church that was out in Oxford Commons, that would be something of a scale that would be required to have a site restoration bond. The different subdivisions of Oxford Commons have had to provide site restoration bonds, not for the individual home that was constructed, but for the mass grading that was taking place. And that was not to get too deep into it, but that was a reaction to 2006, 7, 8, when you know, the housing crisis was afoot. You had a lot of churned dirt that took place, and then a lot of developments that went defunct. And so it was a reaction to how can we at least just get that stabilized so that it minimizes the erosion that takes place, the silting that takes place, and then at least make it more presentable, you know, from a grassing standpoint.
So the bond requirement here is not something that's extraordinary in your day-to-day. Okay.
Only thing that would be a little bit different than what we ordinarily would do is, and we talked about this before with the instance of 208 where might require fill to be brought in. I mean, that's not something that we typically have to see as part of a site restoration bond, because it's just mainly looking at what's required from a grassing standpoint to make this, you know, this flat, or maybe the removal of some, you know, some some walls or something that might be there, some materials that are on site that might have to go. That's not typical of our site restoration bond, but I think it certainly, we could make it.
Or anything specialized, like, you know, covering those walls or anything like that.
Well, with that explanation, that's maybe how that they perceive this to protect the city's interest. If you regularly are doing this, is something that Stuart and y'all deal with on a regular basis. I didn't know that you had to have a bond for the development of a commercial building, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I've got even a couple small jobs that are under construction now, they have to do site restoration bonds. I mean, and they're, you know,
Common thing.
yeah, 2 acre sites or 1 acre site.
I just did one at Harrison's
Yeah.
to turn it from grass to grass.
You sound happy about that.
Sounds like an Ash Wednesday thing.
Well, it seems like the most important thing in all the properties I can think of on the square that we would be discussing would be to preserve the structure next to it, which is, as Griffin said, we're worried about the wall of square books even more than we're worried about, oh, it looks like construction site. We want some pretty flowers. So I guess that would be the very minimum that we need to accomplish, is not letting another building fall down.
But that's in this for it. I mean, they're gonna have to do that before they start this time.
And there's plenty of advice out there about how to do that. Like the Park Service has a whole thing about, it's called mothballing historic buildings. So like different treatments for different types of buildings. Like for that exposed brick versus the roof frame building versus, you know, it wouldn't just be, I guess what I'm saying is there would be sources we could cite. It wouldn't be like subjective, like rip up this wall because the city says to. I think there would be something to point to say, here's how you protect this neighborhood building.
So that's probably about the only element of our discussion that really gives me pause for concern that I would want to discuss with our council as to, you know, rebuilding a wall on someone else's property. You know, I mean, we can control what's taking place on this particular property, but what if the owner of that building doesn't give you any permission, doesn't want that to happen, and he assumes that liability? I think that those are things that are outside of this person's control, and may not get permissions to be able to remedy those issues. You know, so I don't know that we could require that on someone else's property, but I do think that we could require it on the subject property, if that makes sense.
I guess back to Lee's point though, like, I mean, what you have works. Like this, if someone came to us and they wanted to tear a building down because it's unsafe and we go through these steps, it works. My question is, kind of like she was saying, is like, what if you own a building and they're like, oh God, this thing's got to be torn down, and then you're going to have to build it back, and the person's like, nah, I'm not. Like, that's kind of where I was going. Like, what if they're like, I'm not spending the money to what it's going to take to get this thing back, torn down or not? Like, you would never have a bond if you have a condemned building. I mean, do you see where I'm trying to go? Like, if I own the Round Table and they come in there and they say, you're going to have to rip this thing down, you're going to have to put braces up to hold it, you're going to have to put in the restoration bond to, you know, until you figure out what you're doing. And I'm like, I'm not doing it. Is there?
So if you wanted to tear down the Round Table?
I'm just saying, like, if for example, I bought the Round Table and then I find out that it needs to be condemned, but it's still at a point where, like 208 was, where it's still a building. And then they, you know, so you went from, per se, a remodel, which it was going to be a big remodel, but a remodel to, you're going to knock this thing down, you're going to have to build something back, and they say, never mind, this isn't worth it to me. And then we're sitting with
a vacant, unsafe building.
Unsafe building. Do we have anything for that?
I don't think that we have anything.
I think this covers what we just went through last year.
Yeah.
It does.
Don't you think that the land on the square though is so valuable?
That's what I was gonna
sit
say,
on it
yeah.
like that? I mean, it wouldn't make sense. to sit
I don't
on
know
it.
that 208 makes financial sense anymore.
I mean, at a certain point, you have to trust.
On an empty site?
I just think everybody runs numbers.
Yeah.
Man, I'm not to say whether it's a right or wrong move. I just think, you know, some people can or cannot do it.
I mean, I guess to that, I would, to play devil's advocate, I mean, you can't force someone to build a building that they can't afford to build. At a certain point, you know, you can sort of play the scenarios out. At a certain point, you just have to trust that the market will eventually correct that situation. I mean, and if the building is unsafe, uninhabitable, and eventually the city determines that it's condemnable, well, then we're getting into issues that Andy was talking about, that if the city determines it's condemnable, the city can't condemn a building, and then can they then require the landowner to put up a restoration bond when they themselves are the ones that have condemned it? Probably not.
That's what I was saying.
So maybe there should be something that in here that would be like, except in the case of city condemnation or something like that, this restoration bond would be required. I don't know.
I mean, I hear you, but that's also part of the reason why we're here, though, too, having this conversation, is because, you know, you had that public safety exclusion that was invoked, and so, you know, we didn't have plans for anything to go back. We didn't have a landscaping plan that was put in place, and I think that that's what we're saying is, you know, it happened so fast that, you know, short of requiring something presented to the commission at the time that's considered, whether it's for new construction or it's a landscaping plan and or a bond, you know, they could provide us with a landscaping plan and they can provide us with with plans. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be ultimately constructed. Now we have,
and we just don't like it. We just can't. The committee just can't agree on the build back. Just sits there. I don't.
So in that instance, you know, if the city says no, we're being asked to go in there and take a look at it because we believe it's not safe, right? And so we go in and we go through the proper protocols. We have the structural engineers that analyze it, and they say, you know what, this is not safe. And then that's when they're coming before you and they're saying, we need to demolish this. It's been deemed to be not safe by the building official, and here's all of our structural analysis that goes into that, and we have to take this building down. And in that instance, there was not much that any of us could say at that point, right? And so the building comes down, and yet we don't have anything to go back. And short of putting something like this in place, even when the city has to go in there, you know, I think as part of that, you know, there's a responsibility of the building owner, you know, that will have to assume. Now, I've got to have the conversation with Pope and Paul about the city's liability or responsibility in those instances. But, you know, short of having something like this bond, then we're right back to where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I personally feel like this is, for what we're trying to do, is good. There are scenarios you could play out that this may not fix all the situation. You know, this may not fix everything in every scenario that you play out, but
Also, the majority of the time that people come to us because they are trying to move forward. Yeah. So, I mean, this does work.
So let's talk about next steps, and let's talk about going forward. So I know you received this today. I would like for you all to take some time to think about this and chew on it and provide us feedback within, let's say, just 2 weeks from today. Give you ample time. A week from today. I want to make sure you guys have enough time to.
What's the next step? Go to the board with this?
We'll take it to ordinance review and that'd be 2 members of the planning commission, 2 members of the board, the mayor, and then several members of staff would be there, and then we could go 1 or 2 routes. We could take it to the board, or we could bring it back to y'all for any additional comments, and then we can take it to the board.
We'll let them look at it. It's not going anywhere unless they bust it anyway.
mm-hmm.
So we can sit down here and cogitate on it forever and get any traction there. So I'd say send it to
Ordinance review and then go to the board.
and come back to us, just so we'll know what's going on.
So maybe let's have any comments by like the 13th, Friday the 13th, so that's about 2 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys have anything, you can email us or call us or whatever. And then we'll revise and then go to ordinance review committee.
And then we'll bring it back to y'all at your next meeting. And then if it's supportable at that point, we'll give you the
Anybody
feedback.
have any revisions they want to add, or can you go ahead and send it over to the ordinance review?
Say that again.
From us, will anybody have any more comments, do you think, instead of having to wait 2 weeks?
No, I mean, it's above my pay grade. So this is above my pay grade, so
Yeah.
I'd agree
I
with
mean,
it.
mine same. I mean, I don't know if you wanna wait 2 weeks to hear from us, because as you, it's over my head, whether or not, what they're gonna. My only, sort of a general concern is, when Stuart was describing all the things that would have been ideal for us to have asked 208 to do, it just sounded really, really expensive. And are we shooting ourselves in the foot in any way and discouraging? I don't really understand where that money is going to come from, and would that harm the owner in trying to put a new building there later?
So, you two can correct me, but my weather vane is typically 3% on the money. So, that's why we're requesting 2 quotes. So whatever the work entails as part of this plan, they will have to provide a bond, and that's typically, so, say it's $100,000, then they'll have to put up 3% of the money, and that's on an annual basis, right? 3%, and you pay premium.
Depending on the rates that you're getting, but yeah.
That's right. So that's where the money comes from, and so the insurance company is covering, if this bond gets called, then we're gonna assume the full cost, which is gonna be $100,000 worth of work to be implemented, and we'll have that implemented. So yes, it's an additional burden on the developer, property owner.
But it's to make them follow through with the opposite, like rebuild the building, or you're gonna spend $100,000 bricking it and doing this.
Right. So it could be the opposite incentive.
Yeah, you don't want your bond to get called, because that,
It hurts you for a long time. And to be clear, when I was saying what I would have pushed for, that's not necessarily what this commission would have required. That's just what I, as a commissioner, would have sort of been pushing. And you're in a dialogue with them at that point. Where you end up is not necessarily where I would begin. You know what I mean? I mean, we talk things out, we get concessions, we compromise, but I at least would have liked on the back of square books to not be looking at,
Exposed.
yeah, ice and water shield, the membrane flashing. I would like to look at something historical that could fit.
Well, yeah, but this thing about it, though, it came to us in a twister, and it was not much discussion. This thing's got to come down. It's going to come down by itself. Rome is burning. What are you going to do? And there wasn't much decision on our part. We had somebody from the city. They even questioned, why do you want us to be here? The city's got the authority to do this without us. So, it really wasn't an opportunity for us to think through to our defense about what we would do and what would go there later. And I still see that train wreck coming. The city comes in and says, this thing needs to come down, and that's a subjective call, and then the landowner comes in and says, no, I don't think it does, because I don't have to do all this stuff. But I guess you'd have that train wreck wherever. But that's the reason I'm wondering if the city wants to necessarily behold itself to these kind of requirements. If it's truly a public safety issue, does it have to require any of this? I mean, can it not, to like it something different, but you have somebody that doesn't cut their yard, you cut it, send them a bill. If they won't tear it down and won't subscribe to this, you go in there and you demolish it for them, and then send them a bill. But I mean, that's taking it to its extreme.
I understand. Staff was asked by the commission to try and come up with a policy that would try to address the situation that happened at 208 and how we could prevent that in the future. And so that's what we're trying to provide to this commission.
And I think it does that. I mean, it's got all the requirements. I'm just talking about, you asked for comments, and that's just an issue that jumps out to me. Right now, you got authority that you're diluting with this, but that's y'all's call.
So Ben, if at 208, for what happened, all of a sudden one night, we have to take it down, emergency, would you then automatically force the owner to make a bond before the building was taken down?
According to this, yes.
So it might, does that taking a bond, does that happen quickly?
It can be. I mean, it's within a day. I think
the
it's.
whole process for the 208 was over a couple of days because we called a special meeting. So I would think that there could be enough time to.
I guess that's kind of the thing, like Andy's saying, though, like we are adding a lot of time. If the tornado comes,
Right.
and you say, okay, well then we need the stabilization and restoration plan, and I gotta go hire
Hire somebody to.
and they go, hey, it's we'll get to it when we can get to it, or maybe they drop what they're doing. In the meantime, I mean, I don't know. I think this is it is accomplishing the goal, but the other side of it is just
Is it feasible in those instances?
yeah.
I mean, is it, you know, what, the public safety is, you know, the utmost priority, and if you have, you know, professionals that are telling you that this is gonna come down, I mean, I get that too.
I think it's feasible. I mean, a lot of it can be in a narrative form, you know, I mean, for a bond, you know, you sort of come up with a rough order of magnitude. It's nice whole numbers. You're not getting, you know, I mean, you gotta get quotes. I guess the quotes are probably where you're gonna get a bottleneck, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's feasible within a matter of a week, maybe not within a matter of a day.
You have a COVID where lumber goes up 40%. It's just,
Yeah.
I mean, things happen, you know.
This can't be an issue that the Memphises of the world have not encountered, where you got, you know, run down even residential, that you could kind of parlay in commercial. This is not, surely somebody else has seen this issue, is my point, that we could follow or at least mimic, about preserving your police powers and trying to balance it with what you were trying to do it too late. I certainly see why this does address that situation. At least gets us back to something that is, you know, the optics on her are a lot better for sure. Just thinking that when you don't have that luxury, because it was, you know, the barn is burning the day we met. What y'all gonna do? That was pretty much how it's pitched to us.
I'm fine for this to move forward to whoever knows it better than me.
Say that again?
I'm fine with what you have to move forward
So
to,
send this to ordinance review. Y'all provide comments by a week from this Friday, the 13th. And we'll send it to the next ordinance review committee, which we'll organize this month. And then we'll bring it back to your next meeting with an update on what was discussed at the ordinance review and any modifications that we've made. And then we'll also work to reach out to other historic preservation districts to see how they address similar circumstances and issues.
And this may be, okay, so if the city is telling someone they need to demolish their building, the owner of the building, it's in reality, it's the owner's fault for letting their building to get in that condition, is it not?
It can be.
Not necessarily.
And
It can be, but it's not necessarily either.
and that one was bought that way.
Well, the person that bought the property should have known
Yeah.
that it was in that situation.
Yeah, and
They performed a lot of demolition interior.
True, yeah, yeah.
And just a point of clarification, you know, in this instance, we didn't go into the building and say this building's got to come down. We didn't tell the property owner that you have to take this building down. They brought it.
Yeah.
They brought us.
No, I'm not talking about that incident at all. I'm just talking about in a future one.
Right. I mean, sure. I see that can happen in the future. You know, I don't think it's. We're not in the position to go in there and say, oh, this building needs to come down. I think in this circumstance, we were brought into the conversation, and there were, you know, concerns by a variety of different professionals and engineers that, you know, brought the building official in to ultimately make the determination that he made. So,
What's the financial responsibility on the owner if there's demolition by neglect so bad that it's causing a property to have to be condemned?
Right, yeah.
yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, it certainly depends on the circumstances. I mean, ultimately, the plan could be to, you know, remedy the situation. It could be to repair it.
I haven't been through a demolition by neglect, but in the files I read, it's normally that the situation is remedied, not that the building.
That the building comes down, yes. So it's, you know, this building is being neglected, which is causing it to get to a point where it's in a state that it may need to be demolished in the near future. So when that process is put into place, then we say you need to remedy this building. You need to go in and you need to make improvements that's ultimately gonna protect this resource.
So we're kind of hoping and assuming that we would always catch it before it had to actually come down, that it could always be repaired.
Yes.
Okay.
Ben, can you tell us what's happening with 208?
So our last update was, I don't know, it's been 2-3 weeks ago, with the building owner. He received revised plans from his architect for a new design, and I guess it was a new modified design. I think
It was pretty different.
yeah, it was a new modified. I mean, there were some similarities, but it was certainly different. Ultimately, the building owner, we were hopeful that it was going to come before the commission either last month or this month, but then he reached out to us and said he's just not, he wasn't keen on the design, and so he's, I think, going back to maybe the drawing board with the architect to maybe work with the original design and modify it in some way. So I know they're actively working on a design. We've seen a couple iterations of it over the last 6 weeks now. So I know they are actively working on a design, and I think that they would, I think they're bullish on having something constructed there, so.
Good.
Thank you for this hard work on this draft.
Please, we welcome any of your comments.
Okay, we'll
Reach
get
out
them
us.
to you by March 13th.
Maybe I'll get with you and we can both look and call, and so y'all can speak lawyer and, okay.
Kate, you had sent out an email about attending some virtual training. Did you get enough response on that?
Yes.
Okay.
Trying to,
You have to have two? You have to have two people though?
No,
Oh,
You can stand in for this commission and someone else needs to come from HPC.
oh.
which we have.
Thank you,
Which we
Stuart.
have.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
We do have that, so.
I really did. I enjoyed that last
You're
one.
a good man.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
We can have more than one person.
So Stuart has agreed to go to all of them, which satisfies our requirement, but if you guys wanted to just pop in on one or two of them, if you thought it looked interesting, I'm sure they'd be happy to.
They're really fun.
So.
Stuart and I watched one together, and I was texting back and forth, and I was like,
I actually do. I actually enjoyed it, but it's what I do. So I mean,
I find them interesting, obviously, but I'm
Yeah.
here to target markets. Anyway,
Anything else from staff?
no.
Thank y'all for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have a motion to adjourn? And a second? All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
I,
And we are adjourned.
Okay.